York City, the United Nations General Assembly Hall, 193 nations in the room, and on the floor, a resolution. A piece of paper that carried the weight of 400 years of stolen lives, stolen names, stolen futures. The resolution asked for one thing that should have required no debate. It asked the world to look at what was done to African people. The abduction of 12.5 million men, women, and children, the killing of 2.4 million in transit alone, 400 years of systematic terror, and call it what it was. The gravest crime against humanity. That was all. Call it what it was. Not a dark chapter, not a historical event, not a tragedy, a crime. The gravest crime in human history. That is what 54 African nations, the entire African continent standing as one, brought to the world stage. And then the votes were cast. 123 nations raised their hands and said yes. 52 nations, including Britain, France, Germany, the entire European Union, Japan, Australia, looked away and abstained. Did not say yes, did not say no, looked away. And then there were three. Three countries walked to the microphone and said no.
The following states have thus been appointed as members of the board of the 10-year framework of programs on sustainable consumption and production patterns for a term beginning on 25 March 2026 and ending on 24 March 2028. Barbados, Finland, Germany, Hungary, India, Mexico, the Russian Federation, and the Republic of South Africa. I thank the tellers for their assistance. Members are reminded that the following vacancies remain to be filled for a term beginning on the date of the appointment and expiring on 24 March 2028. One member from among the African states and one member from the Asia Pacific states. The Assembly has thus concluded this stage of its consideration of sub-item 1 of Agenda Item 115. I thank the interpreters for the extension granted. The meeting is therefore adjourned.
Before we name the three countries, we must understand what was actually on that floor. Because the way some governments have described this resolution is not what it actually said. The resolution A/80/L.48 of the 80th session of the United Nations General Assembly was brought to the floor on March 25th, 2026. The date was chosen deliberately. Ghana's President John Dramani Mahama, the African Union's own champion for reparations, stood before the assembled world and described what the resolution asked the world to acknowledge. Ghana's Foreign Minister Samuel Ablakwa added the line that cut through everything. Justice does not expire with time. Write that on a wall. Put it in your bio. Say it to the next person who asks why Africa is still talking about slavery. The resolution called for 6 specific things, and not one of them, not one, is unreasonable to any rational human being. First, a formal and full apology from the nations that enslaved African people. Second, restitution, the return of what was stolen. Third, compensation, financial reparations. Fourth, rehabilitation, rebuilding what was destroyed. Fifth, the prompt return of stolen cultural artifacts, artworks, monuments, archives to their countries of origin without charge. Sixth, guarantees of non-repetition. This is not a bill. It is not legally binding. The vote could not force anyone to pay a single dollar. All 193 nations were being asked to do was recognize the truth, and 3 of them could not do it. In a vote of 193 nations, 193 countries that represent every corner of the human family, only 3 walked to the microphone and said no. We are going to name them. We are going to say what they said, and we are going to show you what their history says about why they said it. The United States of America, the country where enslaved Africans built the White House, the Capitol building, and the cotton economy that financed the Industrial Revolution. The country where, in 1865, the Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved people and gave them nothing, no land, no reparations, no restitution. 40 acres and a mule was promised and then taken back. The country where, in 1921, the wealthiest black community in America, Tulsa's Greenwood District, Black Wall Street, was bombed from the air and burned to the ground by a white mob and the state National Guard, and no reparations have ever been paid. The country where, in 2026, that same country's deputy ambassador stood before the world and said, read that sentence again, slowly. Not illegal under international law at the time.
We reject any such suggestions. Indeed, President Trump has done more for Black Americans than any other president and enjoyed historic support from the Black community in the 2024 election. He is working tirelessly to deliver for them and make our country greater than ever. For these reasons, the United States will vote no on this resolution. Thank you.
They are telling you that because the law did not yet exist to call it a crime, it was not a crime. They are telling you that the law is more real than the body. The law is more real than the child dragged from her mother. The law is more real than the 2.4 million who died in the crossing. They are telling you that legality is more important than humanity. The state of Israel, a nation whose entire founding moral argument rests on the world's obligation to recognize and remedy historical atrocities. A nation that has successfully pursued and received reparations from Germany for the Holocaust. Reparations that continue to this day. A nation whose very right to exist is grounded in the principle that crimes against the people, even crimes committed decades or centuries before, create obligations that do not expire. That nation looked at 12.5 million Africans, at 400 years, at the systematic destruction of an entire civilization, and voted no. No explanation for Israel's vote has been reported beyond its alignment with the United States position. No Israeli ambassador made a formal statement on the record. Silence. After voting, no. The Republic of Argentina, a country that, after World War II, became one of the most famous destinations for Nazi war criminals fleeing justice. Adolf Eichmann, Josef Mengele, and hundreds of others were sheltered there. A country whose president, Javier Milei, has aligned Argentina firmly with Donald Trump's politics and openly mocked international institutions. A country where, as of the 2022 census, less than 0.4% of the population identifies as Afro-Argentine, the direct result of a century of systematic erasure of Black Argentine identity. That country voted no, now. Before we go further, we cannot let the 3 no votes distract us from the 52 who abstain. Because abstaining is also a choice. All 27 European Union member states abstain. Britain abstained. Japan abstained. Australia abstained. These are the countries that enslaved African people, that colonized the continent, that transported humans across oceans in chains, that extracted centuries of unpaid labor, and when asked to say the words, just the words, they abstained. The European Union's official explanation, delivered by Cyprus's deputy ambassador, said the EU could not support the resolution because of legal concerns about retroactive application of international law and the use of superlatives that imply a hierarchy among crimes. The use of superlatives. They abstained because calling it the gravest crime creates a hierarchy. They enslaved 12.5 million human beings and extracted centuries of unpaid labor from an entire continent. And their concern, after being asked to say sorry, is about grammar. Let us speak the numbers that the 3 no votes wanted to make abstract. 12.5 million. That is the number of African human beings who were kidnapped, chained, sold, and transported across the Atlantic Ocean between the 15th and 19th centuries. 12.5 million. That is not a historical statistic. That is a number of people who had names, who had mothers, who had children who would never see them again. The United States was built, literally built, on their unpaid labor. The cotton economy that financed the British and American Industrial Revolution was cultivated by enslaved African hands. The sugar plantations of the Caribbean that made France rich beyond imagination were worked by enslaved African bodies. The banks, the insurance companies, the shipping companies, the port cities, all of it, funded in whole or in part by the enslavement of African people. And the consequences did not end with emancipation, because emancipation freed the body and left the structures of theft completely intact. In 2016, researchers at Princeton University calculated that the median white American family has 10 times the wealth of the median black American family, a gap that traces directly to the centuries of unpaid labor, stolen land, and denied opportunity that followed enslavement. In the Caribbean, nations like Haiti paid France $21 billion in what can only be described as the most obscene debt in human history. Reparations paid by enslaved people's descendants to the nation that enslaved them, just to achieve diplomatic recognition. That debt, adjusted for today's value, was finally fully paid off in 1947. Not in 1804 when Haiti freed itself, in 1947. 140 years of paying the people who enslaved you for the right to be free. 140 years. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, stood in that hall and spoke words that every no-vote country needs to hear. The General Assembly President, Annalena Baerbock of Germany, a country that pays Holocaust reparations every year, acknowledged the ongoing nature of slavery's legacy. But in that hall on March 25th, 2026, it was not only diplomats who spoke. Two poets were invited to the floor of the United Nations General Assembly. And what they said, in the most powerful room in the world, broke something open. Esther Phillips, the first poet laureate of Barbados, a Caribbean nation whose entire economy was built on enslaved African labor, read two poems. In the first, In My Ancestors. Gifted me their silence, she imagined an 11-year-old girl walking across a former sugar plantation while the voices of her enslaved ancestors rose from the ground. In the second, Hard Love, she gave voice to an enslaved mother's terror and tenderness, the agony of giving birth while knowing your child could be taken from you the next morning. And Shahada Jack, the first youth poet laureate of Toronto, Canada, read a poem called Reclaiming Our Pen. She said, the spoken word is the closest and most foundational art form to African ancestral storytelling. And she read, in a room that contained the three countries that just voted no, there can be no peace without justice, reparatory justice. Those words, spoken by Esther Phillips, the poet from Barbados, were directed at no one and at everyone. At the three countries sitting in that room who had just voted no, at the 52 who had looked away, at all of us, watching, waiting, demanding. The votes were cast at 3:39 p.m. Eastern Time on March 25th, 2026. By 4 p.m., X was on fire. But it was not just news accounts. Ordinary people, from Accra to Atlanta, from Lagos to London, were saying the same thing. People who grew up being told slavery was a long time ago, a dark chapter, something we need to move past, watching three countries stand in the most public room in the world and say, no, we will not even say it was wrong. The comment that appeared under nearly every post said the same thing in 10 different languages. They built their world on our bones and cannot say sorry. That is not political commentary. That is grief. That is the documented, unresolved grief of a people who watched their story denied one more time in front of the world. On March 25th, 2026, 2 days ago, the world voted. 123 nations said, yes, it was a crime, the gravest crime, and justice must come. 52 nations looked away. 3 nations said no. And in that no, in that single syllable spoken at the United Nations by the most powerful nation on earth, was something that has been said before. It was said in 1865, when emancipation freed the body, but not the land. It was said in 1921, when Black Wall Street burned. It was said in 1955, when Rosa Parks was told to move. It was said in 2020, when a knee pressed down for 9 minutes and 29 seconds on a street in Minneapolis. The same number, dressed in different language, justified by different laws, but always, always the same message. Your suffering does not count as much as our comfort. But here is what March 25th, 2026 also said. 123 nations said yes. The largest regional bloc in the world, 54 African nations standing as one, brought this resolution to the floor, and they won. The resolution passed. The truth is now on the record. It cannot be removed. It cannot be denied. It is entered into the permanent record of the United Nations General Assembly. And then the applause. In a room where words are usually measured and diplomatic and careful, people clapped. Some cheered, some wept, because the world had finally said, officially on the record, for all of history, what our grandmothers knew, what our great-grandmothers knew, what the bodies in the ocean always knew. It was the gravest crime against humanity. 3 countries said no, and 123 said yes. And Ghana's Foreign Minister Samuel Ablakwa spoke the last word. History does not disappear when ignored. Truth does not weaken when delayed. Crime does not rot, and justice does not expire with time. Justice does not expire with time. Share this video, not for views, not for algorithms. Share it because the 3 countries that said no are counting on the world to forget by next week. Do not let them forget. Drop a comment. What do you think the next step should be? What does reparatory justice actually look like? Tell us. This is Black Culture Diary. The ancestors are watching, and we will not be silent.